Dricus du Plessis is now officially the UFC World Middleweight Champion. Other than the fact that he's from South Africa and he speaks Afrikaans, what I really like about Dricus is the fact that he's so authentic. He speaks Afrikaans during interviews. He's not ashamed of thanking his parents and talking about his people and his community. And he's also an ambassador to the Voortrekker Monument in Pretoria, of which such a beautiful shot was displayed in the introduction to his World Championship fight against Sean Strickland. Now, I watched the fight and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I have to say in advance that I'm by no means an expert on the UFC, and I would never have guessed that I would one day do a video on this topic. So in a certain sense, I am way out of my league when talking about fights happening in the UFC, but that's not quite the point of this video. I would like to make some observations from this fight that I believe is not only relevant to the UFC and to physical fighting between two people, but to life in general. Now, I have said before that war and sports are the perfect metaphors for life, especially when talking about strategy and planning. And in a sense, what Dricus is doing is a combination of the two. It is where war and sports overlap, and therefore it is such a useful spectator sport that we can not only enjoy when watching it, but from which we can really learn a lot about life. And so I believe that there is much that we can learn from Dricus in terms of developing strategy and in terms of approaching life in general. And I want to share some thoughts about this with you. So the first point is the significance and importance of defense and offense. Now, it was quite clear to me watching the fight that for most of the fight, Strickland was on the defense. You could see it from his body language, in which he was leaning backwards and getting in a lot of punches from that position, while Dricus was clearly on the offense, clearly there to take that championship. You could see it from his body language, where Strickland was leaning backwards, Dricus was leaning in. Now, Carl von Clausewitz writes about this in his very famous book Vom Kriege, or On War as it is known in English, about a defensive strategy and that of an offensive strategy. Clausewitz makes the point that the person who defends has the advantage, while the person on the offense has the initiative. It's easier to win a fight or a battle when you have to defend yourself, but if you simply defend yourself and you do not go over onto the attack, you will not win the fight. And so there's this paradox between having to defend yourself and wanting to defend yourself, because from a position of defense, in many ways you are stronger, but also recognizing that simply defending is not sufficient, that you need to take the initiative, and you can only do that by going on the offense. And going on the offense is not a safe route to take. It's the high risk, high reward approach, but it is what is necessary to win, not only in the UFC championship, but in life in general. It's about working hard and then taking the thing that you have been working for, not simply waiting for it to fall into your lap. And so the second point is about the advantage of being the underdog. I saw Dricus commenting that he's used to getting booed when he walks into a match because he's often up to contenders that are much more famous and much more popular. And so he has had to build his way up towards the championship by going into matches, getting booed by the spectators, and then walking out as the champion. Now, this is an important topic that I want to do a separate video about, the significance about the David and Goliath phenomenon. Now, up to now, Dricus was always the David. He was always the underdog going into a fight with an opponent that is much better known, that has a better title, and that has a longer history in the UFC. But there's an important point about this David and Goliath phenomenon that I want to point out for now, even though I will elaborate on this in a later video, which is that the source of our strength is almost always also the source of our weakness. And the source of our weakness is almost always also the source of our strength. So looking at David and Goliath, for example, Goliath was big and strong, which was his strength. But as a result of that, he was slow and he was a big target. David was small and weak, and as a result of that, he was forced to think strategically and to make plans that his opponent did not expect. And so there is much that we can learn from Dricus in terms of what it takes to succeed while being the underdog, or the proverbial David. The third point is about taking shots. If you want to get into a ring like this, you need to be prepared to get some shots. And there's some comparison here with the often quoted dictum that the highest trees get the most wind, or that people who actually go out and do things in real life are also the ones who get criticized the most. Now, looking at the statistics from this match, it was quite clear that Dricus, even though he won the match, was not the person who landed the most strikes. Strickland landed many more strikes and also what is known as significant strikes against du Plessis, largely from this defensive position he was in. But the life lesson from this is that the person who ends up winning is rarely the person who took the least shots in the process. Rarely the person who gets criticized the least, and often the person that gets beaten up the most, whether that's literally or figuratively speaking. And so the fourth point is about sticking to the plan. Mike Tyson said that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Dricus did get punched in the face. Many times, over and over again, and not just by any person, but by the UFC World Champion. And it was clear from this match that, at least in the beginning, Strickland had the lead. In the first round, Strickland had the advantage. He landed the most blows, and he seemed to be in control the most. But under these circumstances, Dricus did what was necessary. He stuck to the plan and he measured his opponent. He did not get rattled due to the fact that everything didn't go his way or the way he hoped during the first round of the match. And herein lies an important lesson also about strategy in general. As the Japanese swordsman and strategist Miyamoto Musashi said, "When engaged in 1,000 things at once, remember to concentrate on the principles of the strategic way and find the immovable mindset within you." Or to put this in more simple terms, when things go unexpectedly, remember to stick to the plan. And this brings me to the fifth point, which is somewhat of a paradox compared to the last point, which is the importance of adaptability. And herein lies a paradox indeed. The paradox lies in the importance of sticking to the plan while being adaptable and being able to change your strategy in as far as is needed. Not doing so impulsively, but rather as a calculated decision. This is much easier once you have had the opportunity to measure your opponent or to learn about the environment in which you have to operate. And so this paradox is brought to the fore by Miyamoto Musashi, who in the one hand talks about sticking to the plan, but then he adds by saying, "The way you wield your sword depends on the opponent, the place, the circumstances, and even the direction your enemy chooses to face. But you always wield it so that it is easy to cut down the enemy." This is also why Machiavelli says that if you can, it's good for your army to first engage in several smaller battles with the enemy before you strike a decisive blow on his army. It's the equivalent of what Jim Collins describes as calibrating your cannonballs, learning about the environment, learning about your opponent, determining what works and what doesn't work, and then going in for the kill. In a sense, this is the inverse or the opposite to the adaptability paradox, which teaches that when it is most needed for us to learn new things or to change our approach, we tend to fall back on our old ways of doing, which leads to poor decision making and ineffective solutions. And so the lesson from Dricus is that we have to apply this paradox in the sense that we have to stick to the plan, especially when the unexpected happens. But at the same time, we need to be open to adapt our strategies and tactics based on what the circumstances require of us. And this, of course, is only possible if you have a very clear strategic goal to achieve. In the absence thereof, you will simply be like a leaf blowing in the wind. And so this brings me to the sixth point, which is take decisive action. I remember when I did a course at the Gordon Institute for Business Science, one of our lecturers spoke about decisive action, and he had us repeat the words decisive action out loud over and over again to emphasize the importance of taking decisive action and to underline that this is what distinguishes great leaders from mediocre leaders. And so even when Strickland landed more punches than Dricus did, Dricus took decisive action several times during the match where Strickland did not. This is especially evident in the takedowns, where Dricus had 11 attempted takedowns, of which 6 succeeded, where Strickland didn't have one takedown attempt. The fact that he kept taking the initiative under difficult circumstances and the fact that he kept taking decisive action, to my mind, qualifies him as the better fighter of the two. And so the seventh point is about experience. We live in the real world, and our conduct should be shaped by what we learn in the real world. Yes, theory is important, and there is much that we can learn from books and articles and videos such as these. But at the end of the day, the person that acts in the real world and that learns from his experience will have an advantage that is immeasurable. You can know everything that there is to know about fighting, about the UFC, the rules of the game, the history and so forth, but that does not make you a good fighter. What makes you a good fighter is your ability to go out into the real world and to win matches. And in order to do this, you need experience. You don't necessarily need the most experience, but you need real world experience from which you can learn and improve. And so the moment when theory becomes more important than experience and reality, that is when you get punched in the face. Or ideologically and philosophically speaking, that is when we get to these new ideologies such as wokeness that are based on theoretical, utopian ideas on how to construct a better world or even a perfect society, but that has no relation to the real world or to experience. So an important lesson from this is we need to base our actions on experience in the real world. We can support that by theory, but we should remember that theory is there to support our experience in the real world and not the other way around. Which brings me to the 8th point, which is fitness. The American general Omar Bradley famously said that amateurs talk about strategy while professionals talk about logistics. Now, I should add that many disagree with this because it is indeed true that professionals talk about strategy as well. But the underlying point with this comment is that it's easy and it's exciting to talk about things like strategy, while the important thing that we need to do to actually succeed or to win is the groundwork leading up to the big event. And it is this groundwork that is so often underestimated. There is a reason why Sun Tzu's The Art of War starts with a chapter about estimates, or logistics you might say. Because if the groundwork that is necessary for a battle or a war or a match is not done, you have no chance of winning. So fitness in a UFC match is the equivalent to supply lines in a war. You can have a brilliant strategy and you can be a master tactician. If your supply lines or your fitness is not what is expected of you, you have no chance of winning. It is the underlying and the fundamental requirement necessary for your strategy to succeed. And it is in this point that we tend to underestimate just what makes an achievement such as this so spectacular. Which brings me to the 9th and the final point, which is that it's not the critic who counts. There are countless people out there making YouTube videos such as this one, writing articles and leaving commentary about UFC matches, predicting who would win the match and so forth, and scrutinizing a match in detail after it happened. These people present themselves as experts, and even though many of them are indeed experts, even though many of them are indeed able to point out all the details about every mistake that was made and every successful move that was made during a match, none of them are able to walk onto the field or get into that cage and confront their opponents the way the people they are commenting on are doing this. And this leads to the very important point that it's not the opinion of the guy making a YouTube video, the guy writing an article, or the guy sitting on the pavilion that counts. What counts is action in the real world. Action taken by people who are out there doing real things. And so on this note, I'd like to leave you with the famous quote by Theodore Roosevelt on why it's not the critic who counts. It is not the critic who counts. Not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who, at the best, knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who, at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat.